just to give you a little bit of background about me, I live in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. I live there with my beautiful wife and my home brewery. I am a front-end developer for a company called DS Federal. It's a company based in Rockville, Maryland. I work from home in Oak Ridge. I have been doing web development since about 2001. In about 2005, started using Drupal just on the side. I was not doing it full time. I started doing full time just only in November. So even though I've got a low Drupal user number, or at least relatively low, I probably don't have as much experience as some of you in the room, at least as a full-time developer. So anyway, let's go back to the presentation. If you have it in front of you now, but if you want to download the slides or if you want to download a PDF of this presentation, there's a link there to do that. So now what we're going to talk about, what do we want to try to do with the idea of responsive images? Well, obviously we want to make great looking websites, and you need images to do that. But in this day and age where we have all these different devices, that becomes a little bit more complicated. We want to make our websites look good on any device. And in fact, what we want to do is we want to make our websites look on devices that haven't even been invented yet, because we know that the websites that we're building now are going to last for a few years, or at least we hope they will. And we also know that a lot of the devices that the website will be that people will be using to see the website probably haven't been produced yet. So we want to be future-proof as much as we can. So it turns out there's a little bit of code that you can add to your layout that will make your images responsive. Maybe you've already been using this code. It's max width 100%. And if you want to add height equals or height auto to make sure that you keep the same dimension, you have responsive images. So by the way, you'll see that there's a link at the bottom of this page that goes to a SassMeister. It'll take you to where you can experiment with this code, and you'll see that it is resizable depending on how you've adjusted the width of your screen or your browser. So it's remarkable that we can make all of our images responsive just with that little bit of code. Well, except it doesn't work in Internet Explorer or Internet Explorer 6 or 7, but that's okay because we can just change it to width 100%, and that gives us the same, essentially the same thing. So I guess what I'm saying is that's all you need is to make responsive images is that little bit of code. Thank you, and I appreciate you coming today. And no, it's not quite that simple. So, but why isn't it that simple? Well, there are two reasons. The idea of making one image fit all browsers isn't going to work because obviously all those browsers are of different sizes. We have, if we're trying to cram say in my example here, a 1024 by 768 image, but we're looking at it in say an iPhone that has a roughly 320 or 400 pixel wide screen, it doesn't make any sense. We're giving a lot more image than that device can handle. And so we're making the user download something that's much larger than necessary. The other problem is that a lot of these displays now can handle pixel densities much greater than our desktop monitors generally can handle. So what we have is called a high density display, or sometimes referred to as a retina display. I have an example of how you can think about that high density or retina display. Take a 2 pixel by 2 pixel section of one of those images on your screen, and then put that same image on a retina display. You'll want to have a 2 times, you'll want to multiply that by 2 to get the proper density for that image. Now, what that means, though, is that if you're multiplying by 2, remember your 2 by 2, that means you have to have 4 times the number of pixels on your image. It's the same size display, but it has 4 times as many pixels. So for great images, you must have the right tools. What we're going to use in this presentation are several tools like media queries, breakpoints. We're going to use Sass. Any CSS preprocessor would probably work, but specifically we're going to use Sass because that's generally what is kind of become the standard. And we're going to use Compass, which only works with Sass. We're going to talk about sprites. We're going to talk about icon fonts. We're going to talk a little bit about Modernizer, but the next session with Chad, he's going to talk about Modernizer quite a bit. And we're going to talk about vector graphics, specifically SVG graphics. Then we're also, because this is a Drupal presentation, we're going to talk about 2 modules, picture module and breakpoints module. But before we get too deep into all this, let's talk to make sure that everybody understands what we talk about when we talk about some of those things. Media query is a way of defining a scope for the style sheet. So we can use media queries to define typically display width, but it's not limited to that. We can also use it to define things like display height, orientation, resolution, as we were just talking about, things like that. So the media query uses, in this example where I'm showing the display is set at a specific width for using CSS of, I'm sorry, the media query is defining how the CSS is being used. And you can change then the media query to a different setting for using other CSS. Then breakpoint is a method of using the media query specifically for changing how your page is laid out. What we're talking about is when in breakpoint idea, we're talking really more about page width more than usually, where the size and position of text and images and number of columns are all affected with the different breakpoint settings. The multiplier is how we refer to the different resolutions of the display. So a standard monitor is going to be a 1x multiplier. A retina display is probably going to be a 2x. There's some displays that are like some of the Android devices are a 1.5x display. When we talk about a processor, as I said, we're generally talking about SAS. It's a way of parsing the code using variables and things called mix-ins that are sort of a shorthand method of manipulating your CSS. And the reason why I'm bringing that up in this discussion is because you'll find that SAS or other CSS preprocessors are really helpful when you're dealing with breakpoints, and you really are needing to deal with breakpoints in order to manipulate images. If I'm not explaining that well enough yet, you'll get a better picture as we go along. The other thing that we're going to be using, as I said, is Compass, which is specifically tied to SAS. And what it does is it provides reusable patterns. There's a compass that comes with a set of patterns, and then there are some additional extensions of Compass that apply more patterns. And we'll be talking about that in a little bit. But as I said, one of the main things that we want to do when we're displaying images is to change the size of the image to the appropriate browser, and also to the appropriate display, or appropriate to the display. And Picture Module does that for us. Picture Module makes use of something called a picture fill polyfill. And what a polyfill is, if you're not familiar with that term, it's a JavaScript file that is used to make up for features that the browser itself may not have. So in the case of the picture fill polyfill, what it's doing is it's allowing us to use some tags that would otherwise not be recognized by the browser, specifically the picture tag and the source tag. You'll see in this example, which is just a kind of a streamlined version of it, as an example, the picture tag is framing the use of tags that are calling for the image to be displayed. And you'll see that in this case there are 3 different images being displayed. The standard image source equals that you're familiar with in HTML is the fallback. The other 2, source and then source set equals, those are specific to a display depending on a media query, and you'll see that the media query is included there. Media equals min width 1000 pixels or min width 800 pixels. There's where the media query comes into play. So when we talk about Picture Module in Drupal, we also have to talk about Breakpoints module, because the two pretty much are going to be used together. The Breakpoints module is a way of establishing in your Drupal configuration the breakpoints that you're going to be using in your site, so that your display knows, your layout knows which image to display. And what that results in is that you can control the image size through these 2 modules and through the use of image styles. Image styles comes in Drupal core, and so you are using image styles that you may be already familiar with to change, to set different sizes within your configuration, so that when you upload an image, it automatically gets converted to different sizes. The Breakpoints module and the Pictures module then work together to deliver the appropriate image at the right place and time. So the other thing that image styles allows you to do, in addition to changing size, is to, along with breakpoints module and picture module, is to determine when a high density image is needed. So remember when I said that the image of a high density display is going to be of a factor of 1.5 or 2, resulting in up to 4 times the number of pixels in an image, but we're really just displaying it on the same size as a standard image. So what we can do using image styles is to set it so that we are just blowing it up and then displaying it at the same size as a standard image. Here's an example of what we're doing with picture styles. Is we've taken an image that was initially set at 100 by 100, and then we just resized it to 200. Now you'll think, well, doesn't that make the image fuzzy? No, it doesn't make the image fuzzy. It would if you were looking at it under its normal situation. And we're always told, don't, like in Photoshop, don't blow up an image larger than what its original. But we can get away with this because, remember, we're shrinking it back down to a display of regular size. So even though we've resized it to 200 by 200, we're still planning to display it at 100 by 100. The way to get your picture module and your breakpoints module set up then is to actually ignore them when you're building your site at first. What I find is that if you get caught up in all the breakpoints and trying to get all your sizes worked out, you're going to be changing some of this along the way. The best way really to create a responsive layout is to start with a mobile layout and start making the screen wider and wider and start making changes as things start to get funky looking. Either an image is just too big, or so maybe you need to add another column so that things are laid out a little bit better, or maybe you need to change your fonts and things like that. So if you just start small and start building out, and when things need to be changed, just adding a new breakpoint, eventually you'll have your breakpoints worked out. Now you'll notice that when I was describing that, I didn't say anything about a mobile device, a phone, a tablet, or what have you. I don't design that way, and I don't recommend that, because as we said before, we're designing for devices that haven't even been built yet. So trying to say that our standard phone is of this number of pixels wide and our tablet is this number of pixels wide doesn't really work, because there's a whole range of. So we're designing on the basis of what looks good. So in this case, I am creating breakpoints. In this example, this code that I have here, I'm defining my breakpoints based on what looks good, but I'm calling the breakpoints of something that makes sense to me. I'm calling a breakpoint hamburger because that's when I know that the hamburger icon that is used for the menu is going to appear. And then when the breakpoints tab means that the menu system changes to tabs. And then breakpoint 2 column is then when the display gets broken up into 2 columns. And then breakpoint full features means that I have all the features that I would have in my display. Those are the things that make sense to me, rather than narrow, medium, wide, things like that. I can never remember, well, what's happening in medium and what's different between medium and full. So that's why I try to use descriptions like that for my breakpoints. Now you'll see that what I'm using here is SAS to define those breakpoints, so that the breakpoint hamburger is really just a variable that is being used by SAS. I should have said something earlier, and I failed to do this, that I'm going through a lot of stuff here, but all along the way there are links to all this information, and the reason why I'm not going into a lot of detail is because there are lots of tutorials on the internet, there are lots of videos, lots of blogs, lots of information that gives you all the information you need for all these things that I'm talking about. As I said, I'm using SAS to set those variables, but I'm also using the breakpoints compass extension to make use of those variables, because what the breakpoints compass extension does is that it allows me to say this is a breakpoint, and I can just give it a number, like 20M, and Compass does the rest for me. It writes out the @media, et cetera, that is necessary for the media query. I don't have to write that. The breakpoints Compass extension does that for me. So, as I said, we're going to work on our layout. We're going to get all the breakpoints established before we even start getting into the breakpoints module and picture module. And one of the reasons why we're going to do that is that we want to plug in the information that we have created in our breakpoints into the module, so that the images can be displayed according to the breakpoints. And the way to do that, the easiest way to do that, rather than manually entering each breakpoint, is to collect all of them in a list, as you see here, and then just pasting that into the .info file of your theme. And you'll notice that the order is from largest to smallest. That's important for getting the breakpoints module configured correctly. So you have to do a little bit of reformatting so that it matches this style as opposed to what was in my SAS configuration. But essentially, if you follow this style, copy and paste into the .info file of your theme, and then clear the cache, it will automatically suck that information into the module. And as you see there. There are a few other things that you're going to do. One of which I mentioned earlier was you're going to set your image styles to reflect different sizes of images. So when you upload an image through the image field of your node, it will know then which of those sizes it needs to recreate, and it may involve cropping. So then once you've got your image style set, you have another step that you need to do, and that is to pair up the image styles with the breakpoints. And that's where this step that I'm showing right here is where you're mapping the image sizes to the different breakpoints. Now, you may have, in the case of, let's say, I think in my example I was using 5 different breakpoints, and since you may have multipliers, and so you've got 3 different resolutions of images, so that, what is that, if I'm doing the math right, that's 15 different images per configuration. That's a lot of kind of figuring out to do, but you may not necessarily have to use a different image style for every breakpoint. So think through and you don't have to enter a specific image for every single breakpoint. So then one final thing that you need to do is you have to set the content type to display the image through the manage display part of the content type. So in this, you'll see in this example that the primary image is being changed from image, which is the default setting if you're using the image field, then you're changing that to picture, so that every time an image is being called for in your display, that the picture module is then selecting the appropriate image depending on the other parameters that you've set in the breakpoints module. So I hope that explanation made sense, but the result here is that between picture module, breakpoints module, and of course image styles, you're getting a different image for each circumstance that you've set in your layout. And you see in this example, you can have square images for one breakpoint and rectangle for another. You're not limited in just changing resolution or changing size, but you're allowed then to change how you're cropping it. So the only downside of this whole thing well, besides the fact that there's a lot of configuration, it takes a lot of time, and that's why I encourage you to wait until you've got most of your layout worked out before you even get into getting in your development, you don't really have to have picture sharp images for retina displays because it's still in development. But get all that worked out, but not every image necessarily has to be run through the picture module and breakpoint module. There are some images that are like icons that are not going to be appropriate for that kind of a situation. So, but we still want to handle these responsively. We still want to make sure that they are handled with the correct resolution, and so they're really sharp for the high density displays. One way to do that is with sprites. I realized that when we had the mess up with the display, that I was going to look at the results of the Survey Monkey, and I'm sorry that I didn't do that. Let's see. You guys can't see this because it's not part of your connection, but the first question was how much of the development work is on the front end. About 2/3 of you said most of the time, 1/3 said sometimes, and one person said never or almost never. Then the other question was in regard to how much do you work with or have knowledge of certain parts of design. Almost 60% of you say that you have experience with and use frequently responsive web design. The areas where you either have a little bit of knowledge but not, or have at least tried it out, are font icons and SVG images. So that's now the area in which people say they have very little knowledge of or experience with is high density images. So that's where we're turning our attention to try to pick up some of those things that maybe you are unfamiliar with. So if you have ever used a sprite, you'll recognize this example that I have where there's lots of stars that are being used for different kinds of numbers of stars in 5-star rating or something like that. And then you have some CSS that goes along with it to break up the number of stars for that particular CSS class. The idea here is that the browser is loading an image once and then is displayed dependent on the CSS rather than loading that image each time. It cuts down, in theory, on the number of calls to the server that the browser has to make. There are several ways that you can make a sprite. One, of course, is Photoshop, and I don't really recommend that because the issue with Photoshop is you then have to figure out what the CSS calls are for that particular chunk of your image, and you may not want to be locked into that as you're developing. You may want to be changing some things, and you want to maybe add some more images, and so you're going to have to keep going back and keep configuring the CSS for that image. So there are two ways in which you can streamline that process. SpritePad is an online tool. It's free because you just go online to the website and you upload some images, and then you kind of map out where those and it does all the automatically mapping out each of those images, creates one image that you can then download, and you also then copy the CSS that it gives you. A similar application is called Sprite Master Web. I think it's about $4 for Mac, and it does essentially the same thing. So as you're developing, if you wanted to make some changes, it's a little bit easier. You can do that without quite the fuss that you have with Photoshop. But keep in mind that if you are doing this with true responsive images, you're also going to have to take in consideration the retina and high density displays, which is going to multiply the number of images that you have to include in your sprite. So the result is that you may end up creating a larger image than you really think you are. So you may not be saving bandwidth like you thought you were when you're creating a sprite. And as I said, they are a pain to maintain as you're developing because you are keep adding images and what have you. Now there is one way in which you can make sprites on the fly without having to do, without any concern about having to recreate the images, and that is to use another Compass extension that allows you to just dump images into a folder or directory in your theme, and SAS will automatically create one image and automatically create the styles that are and the variables that are needed for using that image. So that is a even faster way of doing it, because every time you want to add another image, you just add it to that directory. And everything gets automatically calculated. Now the first time that you do that, SAS is going to have to, or Compass, which is running the processing for SAS, is going to take a while to crunch all that out. But each time you add one, it won't be nearly as slow. But again, you could be creating a rather large image when, especially, this is going to especially be true as a concern, if you are only using a small part of that large image for a specific page. You're loading the entire image and maybe only using a small piece of it. So sprites on the have been popular for cutting down on page load time, but in responsive design, they aren't as useful as they once were when we only had one type of display to be worried about. And that's where icon fonts have come into play. They allow us to have resizable fonts, scalable to whatever size we want, and all browsers can display these because all browsers can display fonts, and these icons are just another font. They're also smaller than images are, so they have that advantage. Plus, you can do some things with them through CSS to add color, texture. You can even do a little bit of animation with the CSS. You don't have to worry about browser compatibility pretty much because all the modern browsers can handle it just like they can handle fonts these days. If you remember the old days when you had to worry about what fonts were on a person's machine and that was all we had to work with, well, those days are long gone. But you have to be a little bit careful as you are working with icon fonts because accessibility can be an issue depending on what method you're using to display them. And by accessibility, I'm talking about usually an icon font is displayed by indicating a letter or a series of letters to display an icon. And for screen readers that people with sight impairment are using to view the web, screen readers will look for that character and try to read it just like they would any other text on the page. So you need to find some tricks, and there are some tricks to mask that so that the screen reader will ignore it. Another thing that you can do with icon fonts is to create your own set. There are lots of icon fonts available that are, many of them are open source, and there are then some services that will allow you to pick specifically the icon fonts that you wish to use, so you're narrowing the size of your icon file, or the font file. I've listed 3 sites here that allow you to do that, and in most of these cases you can actually pick from different libraries. So I like this icon from this library, but I like this one better for this from this other one for this other icon. Like I like the Twitter icon from this font library, but I like the Facebook icon from this other library. These services will allow you to mix and match that way. There's another way, though, that we can use icon fonts, and it turns out that that's the Drupal way. There's a module called Font Awesome that makes use of the Font Awesome library. The Font Awesome library has 480 some icons, so it's one of the larger libraries to begin with, and it then allows you to, through the convenience of having a module, be able to pick and choose which icons you want. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this for all applications because you're making use of all of the fonts, plus you're adding the additional overhead of another module. But in some cases that is handy. For example, in this situation where I recently was on a project where we needed to be able to provide the client with the ability for their content people to select an icon. And we wouldn't know what icons they wanted because we couldn't predict what what the content was when they were making use of this icon. So all we needed to do was make use of the font icon or the Font Awesome module and tell the user to go to the Font Awesome library, look for the class that was associated with the icon that they wanted, and then plug that class into a field of the node that they were creating, and then that would automatically, through the magic of our display that we created, would select the appropriate icon. Font icons or icon fonts are great, but they aren't great for every circumstance. They aren't very good when you're trying to use more than one color. And let's face it, a lot of times we want our icons or our logos to have multiple colors. There are clients that would expect that. So that's where we might want to consider a vector image rather than using let's see, a PNG or a JPEG image, because the SVG image will allow us the same flexibility that the icon font does in terms of scalability, but it does with full color. Just like the icon font, it's completely scalable, and it doesn't matter what resolution, so you're just creating one file rather than multiple files for all these different circumstances like we have to do with pictures. And regardless of how big or small, it's because it's scalable, it's only one file that's being displayed. And it turns out that SVG allows you to do things like layers, which you can assign classes to, and you can, through CSS, you can have different layers of this file being displayed at different times. I don't go into specifics in my presentation here on that, but I was going to try to work it in, and I didn't have time to squeeze everything in here. So, but I wanted to bring that point out, is that one of the neat things about SVG graphics is that you can add layers and then display only a portion of those layers depending on breakpoints or however else you want to do. You could, as I said, you could do animation in interesting ways with those layers. A lot of people have kind of shied away from SVG images because they assume that their browser won't display it, but pretty much all modern browsers will display an SVG image these days, starting with Internet 9 and up, and pretty much all other browsers. So there's really no reason to avoid an SVG image unless you specifically know that you're going to need to provide a functional site for, say, an IE7 or IE8. Well, hopefully not 7, but I have a client right now where we're working with that. They know that some of their audience is in places like Vietnam and China because they kind of cater to the Pacific Rim, and a lot of the users in the Pacific Rim are on older browsers, so they have to be careful with that. But you can, through the use of media queries, you can write an alternate image to display when an SVG graphic is not available. And I kind of skipped ahead to make this point, that it's easy to create a vector image. What I've done here in this image is gone to Illustrator and taken an Illustrator file and just simply saved it as an SVG file. And that's really all that's needed. There are a couple of settings that are available, but the general defaults that are provided in Illustrator will take care of that. So that's another concern that some people have, is how do I work with SVG images? And my point here is you don't have to worry about that if you have Illustrator. To apply then the image, it can be as simple as just using the same method you would apply the image if it were a JPEG or a PNG. So there are some circumstances, as I started to talk about, where an older browser might be in place. Well, we can use Modernizer. As I said, there's a presentation coming up on that, so I won't get into that. And I need to kind of move along here since we've got a little bit of a late start. But Modernizer applies a bunch of classes that you can work with. And one of those that is the SVG class. So you can write your CSS around the fact that there's a class there that tells you that an SVG can be displayed by that browser. You can run a pixel density query, a media query by the breakpoints compass extension as well. And here's an example of how that is done. If you're not sure what your browser can handle, there is a website that tells you you are looking at this web page, and there's the URL for that page. You are looking at this browser through a display that can provide this kind of a pixel ratio and resolution. And it will also, if you scroll down, then it'll give you a list of all the devices that that are similar in that. So if you're unsure, that's one way of determining. The other way is a website called Can I Use, which all you have to do is say, okay, can I use SVG? And you type in that, and it will then tell you what browsers can use SVG. Or can I use the @fontface in my CSS? You just type in @fontface, and it will tell you all the browsers that can use that. All right, so let's wrap this up. How do we know when we've reached the goal? Well, the goal is reached when our images are being displayed that are appropriate to the design layout and the context that the images are in. So by context, I mean things like the columns and the width of the display. We are also optimizing so that when a high density display is calling for that image, that the image is appropriate to that. And we're also making use of different MIME types that make the image sharp for all displays. So I want to thank you again. In this presentation, you'll have, once I shut down here, you won't, and you close your browser, you may not have this site available to you again, but you can always download and get all the links that I've provided, all the references. There's lots of them there, and it will give you a lot more depth of the things that I covered. So there's a link to the presentation, and if you have any questions, I'm sorry we pretty much don't have time for any questions because of the delay in getting started, but you can reach me at any time, Twitter, IRC, or email.